throwing cyber rocks from the ivory tower. Hey, it's Prince of Queens, and the general strategy of influencing votes both for the Republican Party and the Democratic Party is to convince one side that they are better than the other. In general, right-wing people tend to think that they work harder than liberals, and they pride themselves on the fact that they pay taxes. On the other hand, in general, left-wing people tend to pride themselves on the fact that they are supposedly better educated and more worldly than right-wing people because they live in culturally diverse urban meccas and go to four-year universities more often. They call red states flyover states. This leftist dismissiveness was particularly easy to use as a way to demonize right-wing people in the 1990s, when very few people were on the internet, as everybody thought that the internet was simply for nerds back then. Republicans were assumed to just be a bunch of rednecks and hicks by Democrats. Then during the Bush years, this attitude of shaming the right wing for being simpletons remained similar, as you can see in Michael Moore's documentary Fahrenheit 9/11, which was supposed to be the end of George W. Bush, but seemingly ended up backfiring when it turned out that Republican voters don't like being called stupid. Still, this attitude of shaming conservatives, libertarians, and other people that are more inclined to vote for the Republican Party never went away. And of course, it came back tenfold during the Obama years, where its potency became more intense. You see, Facebook, which is probably still the most popular social media site, grew exponentially in user base after Obama got into office. If people remember things clearly, towards the end of last decade, only relatively young people tended to be on the social media sites like MySpace. But by 2012 or so, everybody's entire family was on Facebook. At this point, things became more complex because all of the leftists that had moved to big cities or had gone away to college now had their family members and hometown friends regularly interacting with people in their current social reality, which I don't think had ever happened in human history. And the Democratic Party especially didn't like it one bit. You see, the Democrats had long gotten by on getting votes by demonizing Republicans as racists, homophobes, and sexists, but this became a lot more difficult if entire social networks had a direct line with people by way of social media, and they could easily ask them questions. If a leftist were to complain on Facebook about Republicans wanting to clamp down on immigration from Mexico, as if obviously the only reason they'd want to do that must be because of racism, and then their Republican cousin that lives in Arizona happened to say, I don't care about legal immigrants, I'm friends with a few, and let me tell you, they hate illegals more than anyone I know. That really tended to complicate the narrative. What happens when leftists realize that right-wing voters don't necessarily have a problem with Mexican people and might even be friends with more immigrants than they are? Thus, it could be speculated that this strengthening of communication between demographics of people with varying political beliefs by way of social media was more than likely the inspiration for so many people to redefine and shift the goalposts around what is considered racist in leftist culture, which was also used to redefine almost every other form of bigotry. Here's the thing. If Republicans could actually explain their political beliefs to Democrats by way of social media, it was harder to call them racists, because by the time Obama was in office, the drastic majority of Republicans were well aware that they needed to do a good job convincing everybody they knew that they weren't racist. And they knew how to do that pretty well, because most of them weren't actually racist. And you see, Things get rather complicated when you take into account the fact that a huge percentage of Republican voting people think that the Democrats are the real racists, and they could use that fear of being considered racist that Democrats seem to unanimously share against them, and explain the long history of racism coming from the Democratic Party. And the Democrats in power did not like that one bit. Thus, we had things like the introduction of the concept of microaggressions put on the table, which socially legalized calling people racist for innocuous statements or questions, basically at the convenience of whomever wants to believe that somebody might be racist. Also, I remember dozens of my SJW friends sharing this tweet on Facebook as if it was the most brilliantly clever thing that they had ever read. All the while, I was thinking to myself that I couldn't relate in the slightest because I didn't believe my friends from high school to be racist. Finally, of course, after the narrative was doctored that even people who didn't think that they were racist, who didn't want to be racist, and didn't even necessarily show signs of actually being racist, were still somehow secretly racist, eventually, after everybody in America was suspected of being a racist, the blog articles came out about how people should unfriend and block everybody who was racist, which had largely become the general social etiquette among the left. Did one of your friends who still lives in Montana criticize Black Lives Matter protesters for burning down their own neighborhoods? He's telling black people how to feel about their own oppression, and thus he's a racist. Block him. Are you a black girl and your white female friends that you knew in college were complimenting one of your photos, saying that they wish that they could get their hair to look like yours in the picture? Clearly, that's a microaggression. You should block all those white girls. Did a white male cousin of yours, who works 2 jobs while going to graduate school for chemistry, make a post about how he doesn't feel like he is particularly privileged because he knows a Native American student in his program that got a scholarship and doesn't even really study very hard, and he thinks that that's kind of a shit deal for him, and he doesn't think that he has white privilege? Uh-oh. Disown your cousin. Block him. He's a racist. Ultimately, once again, I think all of this had a backfiring effect. Eventually, people realized that the only way to be considered non-racist or non-misogynist or non-transphobic was to parrot all of the far leftist talking points coming from university students and the blogosphere that was shared on social media. If these people didn't agree with SJWs on Facebook, they would be first shamed publicly, like stones being thrown from an ivory tower in cyberspace, and then blocked so that they couldn't even defend themselves. Eventually, they all got tired of it, and that's why we have Trump as our president. And of course, since so many of these people are still not in contact with the left wing, they can't explain themselves. And Antifa gets to call them all Nazis and feel okay with literally throwing rocks at them if they bother to show up to free speech rallies and make their voices heard. Nope, the time for discussion is over, says the left. Really, they thought it was over years ago. Obviously, in order for people to have a president that people can feel collectively proud of having in office, we're going to have to start encouraging dialogue between people from both sides of the political spectrum. However, for whatever reason, the leftists of the Western world seem to be the ones most adamantly against allowing this to even happen. And that makes me really wonder what the high-ranking members of the leftist quote-unquote intelligentsia are really doing up in their ivory towers while their minions throw stones so carelessly. That's all I have to say for this video. Stay tuned.